They made a fatal error when they decided to target me. The morning I appeared most vulnerable, standing in my work clothes at 5:30 a.m. watching two patrol cars pull into my driveway, was actually the moment I became unstoppable. You see, Barbara, Whitfield thought she'd finally crush the obstinate rancher with her $2,600 in fabricated fines and squadron of city inspectors. What this HOA chairwoman didn't realize: I'm a retired Army Corps engineer who dedicated 22 years to solving impossible problems. While she was playing suburban dictator, I was quietly constructing a case that would cost her everything: her freedom, her stolen $190,000, and her precious silver Mercedes. Here's the magnificent part. My 52-acre ranch was never even within her HOA jurisdiction. Great-grandfather's property predates their development by 38 years. What would you do if someone attempted to steal your family's heritage with fraudulent documents? Drop your reaction in the comments. I'm willing to bet half of you recognize exactly what I'm describing. Trust me, what unfolds next will absolutely make your day. The setup: paradise under attack. Let me rewind and explain how this entire disaster began. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 44 years old, and after 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, all I desired was some tranquility on the land my great-grandfather bequeathed to me. This isn't some suburban tract home. We're discussing a 52-acre working ranch in unincorporated Travis County, Texas, complete with rolling meadows, century-old mesquite trees, and stone fence posts my great-grandfather constructed by hand back in 1948. Every dawn, I'd wake to the sound of meadowlarks calling across the pasture, the distant bellowing of my neighbor's cattle mixing with the aroma of cedar posts and morning dew on native grass. I'd run my palm along those weathered oak gate latches great-grandfather installed, feeling the rough texture of limestone he'd quarried himself. This place possessed character, something you can't purchase in a subdivision. After a bitter divorce and 2 decades of military structure, I was finally prepared to decelerate. I'd launched a small earth-moving and site preparation business. Nothing elaborate, just me and some machinery helping neighbors with stock tanks and access roads. Honest work that covered expenses and kept me outdoors. That's when I encountered Barbara Whitfield. The Dragon Lady. Picture this: 56 years old, immaculately styled auburn hair that probably costs more than my monthly hay bill, driving a silver Mercedes SUV that she maintained so spotless you could eat off the bumper. Barbara relocated here from Arizona about 4 years ago with her husband, some middle management city employee, and designated herself the neighborhood's compliance enforcement chief. Barbara served as HOA chairwoman of Meadowbrook Estates, a development that emerged in the late 1990s, roughly a half-mile from my property boundary. For 9 years straight, she'd been elected unchallenged, primarily because nobody else wanted the aggravation. But Barbara thrived on this authority. She had developed a reputation for targeting what she termed incompatible properties. And, if you read between the lines, you'd observe those properties typically belonged to folks who didn't resemble her country club demographic. The first shot, the initial assault in what would evolve into World War III, arrived at my gate on a Tuesday morning in February. I'm referring to an official-looking citation printed on expensive letterhead: violation of CCNR 382, unsightly commercial equipment. Attached are photographs of your grandfather's 1965 International tractor, a machine that still operated like clockwork and possessed more character than Barbara's entire subdivision. The fine, $200, escalating to $75 per day until the violation was resolved. The contact information led directly to Barbara Whitfield, Compliance Review Officer. I'm a rational person. My initial impulse wasn't to escalate. It was to pick up the phone and courteously explain the circumstances. "Ma'am," I said when she answered, "I believe there's been some sort of misunderstanding here." "The misunderstanding," she snapped back, "is thinking you can operate a scrapyard adjacent to our community." Before I could clarify that I wasn't part of her community legally speaking, she disconnected. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with someone interested in reasonable discussion. The escalation campaign. 7 days later, citation number 2 materialized. Violation of CCNR 423 livestock nuisance. The photograph depicted my 4 horses, Thunder, Belle, Scout, and Apache, grazing peacefully in a pasture where horses had grazed for 8 decades. The fine jumped to $2,500, and this time there was a threat. Legal proceedings and law enforcement. Intervention will follow continued non-compliance. I sat on my porch holding that citation, while the evening breeze carried the fragrance of wild roses and the sound of mockingbirds beginning their nightly concert. This woman was essentially declaring war on everything my family had established. Here, the problem was Barbara Whitfield had no comprehension of who she was confronting. She perceived an isolated rancher she could intimidate into submission. What she didn't recognize was a man with 2 decades of military problem-solving experience, an engineering degree, and absolutely zero tolerance for petty dictators. Time to educate Mrs. Whitfield about the distinction between authority and actual power. The research phase. But Barbara wasn't finished. She was just getting started. Citation number 3 arrived on a Thursday. Violation of CCNR 6.7, unauthorized. Structures. This time she'd photographed my great-grandfather's hand-built workshop from 1951, a structure that had endured 8 decades of Texas weather and still stood more solid than most of the McMansions in her subdivision. Then came Citation 4. Violation of CCNR 8145, improper commercial signage. My transgression? A modest wooden sign at my entrance that read, Thompson Excavation, licensed and bonded in simple white letters. The same sign that had been there for 4 years, without a single complaint. I began noticing that silver Mercedes cruising past my property every morning around 6:45 a.m. and every evening around 5:30 p.m. She wasn't even attempting discretion. Windows lowered, phone in hand, capturing photographs like some kind of suburban surveillance operative. One morning, I caught her actually measuring my fence line with a measuring tape, wearing designer jeans and hiking boots that probably cost more than my monthly equipment payment. That's when I decided it was time to do what I should have done initially. Actual investigation. The legal discovery. The following morning, I drove to the Travis County Clerk's office and pulled every property record, plat map, and deed dating back to 1945. Here's what I discovered, and this is something every property owner needs to understand. You cannot retroactively incorporate property into an HOA. Period. The law is unambiguous on this point. My land was deeded to my great-grandfather in 1948. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA was established in 1986, 38 years later. According to the original HOA subdivision maps, my property was specifically excluded from their boundaries. In legal terms, Barbara possessed about as much authority over my land as she did over Mars. Armed with a manila folder full of documentation, I called Mrs. Whitfield again. This time I was prepared. Mrs. Whitfield, this is Marcus Thompson. I have the original plat maps right here from the county clerk, and I believe we need to resolve this confusion. I don't care what your little documents say, she interrupted. This neighborhood has standards, and you're diminishing everyone's property values with that disaster of a property. Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm not in your neighborhood. I'm not in your HOA. My property precedes your development by 4 decades. We'll see about that, she snapped and hung up again. The woman possessed the diplomatic skills of a porcupine, but I had to acknowledge her persistence. The fake survey stakes the next morning, I discovered just how persistent. Walking out to feed the horses, I noticed fresh survey stakes driven into my property, bright orange plastic markers with yellow ribbon attached. Someone had spray-painted blue marks on my mesquite trees, marking what appeared to be a new boundary line that conveniently included about 8 acres of my land within the HOA territory. I followed the trail of stakes and paint. It was like following breadcrumbs through a nightmare, except this nightmare involved property theft and a woman who clearly believed she could redraw county boundary lines with a can of spray paint. The metallic ring of those survey stakes being hammered still resonates. In my memory, the smell of fresh paint mixed with the morning air created this surreal contrast. Industrial chemicals marking up God's countryside. Those cold metal stakes felt alien against the rough bark of trees that had been growing since before Barbara was born. Here's the plot twist that changed everything. I had security cameras. After my divorce, I'd installed a basic security system. Nothing fancy, just enough to monitor the equipment and ensure nobody was tampering with the horses. Those cameras captured everything. The silver Mercedes arriving at 5:23 a.m., Barbara stepping out with a hammer and a bag of survey stakes, and spending the next 90 minutes playing property developer on land that wasn't hers. I removed those stakes and stored them in my workshop as evidence, every single one. But I left the spray paint marks on the trees. I wanted to see how far she'd push this scheme. Turns out, pretty far. The false police report 2 days later, my phone rang. "Mr. Thompson, this is Sergeant Martinez with the Travis County Sheriff's Office. We've received a complaint about destruction of official survey markers on HOA property. I need to come out and speak with you." And that's how Barbara Whitfield made her first major tactical blunder. She just filed a false police report claiming I'd destroyed official survey markers that she'd illegally placed on my property. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and she had no idea what she'd just stepped into. When Sergeant Martinez pulled up my driveway 45 minutes later, I was ready for him. Not ready to fight, ready to educate. There's a distinction, and it's a distinction that would save my situation and cost Barbara dearly. "Mr. Thompson," the sergeant said, exiting his patrol car, "we've received a complaint about destruction of HOA property. Something about survey markers." "Sergeant, I appreciate you coming out here," I said. "But before we proceed, I think you need to understand the legal circumstances we're dealing with." I handed him my manila folder, the same one I'd tried to show Barbara. Property records, original plat maps, deed documentation going back 75 years. Sergeant Martinez was a professional, and he took time reading through everything. "Sir," he said after about 15 minutes, "according to these documents, your property was never part of the HOA. That's correct. And the survey markers Mrs. Whitfield claims I destroyed, they're in my workshop. She placed them on my property without authorization at 5:23 a.m. last Thursday. I have it all on security footage." The education begins. Here's something everyone needs to know. Filing false police reports is a misdemeanor in Texas, punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a $3,000 fine. Sergeant Martinez explained this to me as we walked to my workshop to examine the evidence. "These aren't official survey stakes," he said, handling the orange plastic markers. "These are the type you purchase at Lowe's for $15. Official boundary surveys require licensed surveyors and county approval." I showed him the security footage on my phone. There was Barbara, clear as daylight, trespassing on my property and placing fake survey stakes. The sergeant shook his head and made some notes. "Mr. Thompson, it appears you're the victim here, not the perpetrator. I'll need to file a report about the false complaint, but I don't see any crime committed by you." As the sergeant was leaving, he mentioned something that made me smile. "You know, my brother Carlos needs some land cleared for a stock tank project. You still doing that type of work?" "Tell him to call," I said. "But apparently I'm not permitted to have work equipment according to the neighborhood patrol." "Sergeant," Martinez laughed, "that lady certainly seems determined. Good luck with the situation, sir." The coordinated attack, but Barbara wasn't finished making my life complicated. She was just beginning what I now recognize was a systematic campaign to drive me off my own land. 4 days after the sergeant's visit, I got a call from a city inspector. "Mr. Thompson, this is Jennifer Walsh with the City Planning Department. We've received an anonymous complaint about potential zoning violations on your property. I need to schedule an inspection." The timing was suspicious, but I have nothing to hide. "Come on out," I told her. "How about tomorrow morning?" Here's where Barbara's husband's position at the city became relevant. Suddenly, I was receiving anonymous complaints from multiple city departments. Code enforcement wanted to examine my septic system. The fire department needed to verify my burn permit compliance. Environmental services had questions about water drainage. It was like watching a coordinated assault unfold, and the coordination was originating from inside City Hall. But here's the advantage of military training. It teaches you to prepare for everything. My property was cleaner and more regulation compliant than most suburban developments. Every permit was current. Every system was properly maintained. Every piece of equipment was legally registered and insured. Inspector Walsh arrived at 7:30 a.m. sharp, and I could tell within 10 minutes that she was a decent person just doing her job. She spent 3 hours examining everything with meticulous attention and found exactly 0 violations. "Mr. Thompson," she said as we concluded, "I've been doing this for 18 years and your operation is textbook compliant. Whoever filed this complaint was either misinformed or—" She paused diplomatically. "Or they had ulterior motives," I finished. "Between you and me," she said quietly, "that HOA lady contacts our office about 4 times weekly. Different complaints, same property. We're beginning to recognize a pattern." Uncovering the broader campaign, that's when I realized I needed to understand the full extent of what I was confronting. So I did what any good engineer does when facing a complex problem. I gathered data. I spent the following week researching public records, and what I found made my blood boil. Barbara hadn't just targeted me. Over the past 3 years, she'd filed complaints against the Rodriguez family, Hispanic, 15 code enforcement calls about overcrowding in a house where 4 generations lived together. Michelle Parker, single mother, 11 complaints about her. 12-year-old Toyota being an automotive repair business, Robert Williams, elderly Korean War veteran. 9 reports claiming his travel trailer constituted vagrant camping. The pattern was unmistakable. Barbara was systematically harassing anyone who didn't fit her suburban ideal, and she was using city resources to do it. But she'd made one critical error. She'd picked a fight with someone who knew how to fight back. The digital campaign Barbara decided to take her campaign online because apparently harassing me in person and through City Hall wasn't sufficient. She needed to recruit an army. She created a Facebook group called Concerned Residents of Meadowbrook and started posting photos of my property with captions that would make a tabloid editor proud. "Hazardous heavy machinery threatens children's safety," she wrote under a picture of my excavator parked in my own driveway. "Industrial operation destroying residential property values" accompanied a photo of my great-grandfather's workshop, taken from the public road with a telephoto lens. The woman had missed her calling as a propaganda minister. But here's where Barbara made another tactical error. She underestimated the intelligence of her own neighbors. The HOA meeting infiltration. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, not as a member, because I wasn't one, but as an interested neighbor who wanted to understand what all the commotion was about. I sat quietly in the back of the community center, wearing my best jeans and a polo shirt, taking notes and trying to blend in. What I witnessed was like watching a one-woman show titled The Barbara Whitfield Experience. She dominated every discussion, interrupted anyone who disagreed with her, and made unilateral decisions while the other board members just nodded along like bobbleheads. But I noticed something else. 4 of the 6 board members looked uncomfortable, really uncomfortable, especially when Barbara started her presentation about undesirable elements threatening our community standards. After the meeting, as people were filing out, a petite woman in her 70s approached me. "You're the ranch owner she's been targeting," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Marcus Thompson." I extended my hand. "Dorothy Kim. I'm the HOA secretary." She glanced around nervously. "Could we talk privately sometime? There are things you should know about the financial situation." Now that was interesting. Of course, Mrs. Kim. "When works for you? How about tomorrow morning? Murphy's Cafe on Oak Street, 7:30 a.m. The financial bombshell." The next morning, over coffee and pancakes, Dorothy Kim changed everything. "Mr. Thompson," she said, stirring cream into her coffee with trembling hands, "I've been secretary for 4 years, and I've been seeing things that don't make sense. Barbara has been making financial decisions without board approval, and when I ask questions, she dismisses me." "What kind of decisions?" I asked. "Large payments to consulting companies, landscape consulting, security services, administrative fees. But when I try to see the actual contracts or invoices, she says they're confidential vendor agreements." Dorothy pulled out a small notebook. "Last year alone, we paid $94,000 in these consulting fees. but our actual landscaping costs should only be about $35,000, and we don't have any security services. I felt that familiar sensation when puzzle pieces start clicking together. Mrs. Kim, have you ever heard of a company called BW Enterprises? Her eyes widened. That's one of the companies we've been paying. How did you know? Lucky guess. What else can you tell me about the financial irregularities? For the next hour, Dorothy laid out a pattern of suspicious transactions that would make an auditor weep. Shell companies with names like BW Safety Solutions and BW Management Services billing the HOA for services that were either never provided or grossly overpriced. The knowledge bomb? Here's a knowledge nugget everyone needs to understand. HOAs are quasi-governmental organizations, which means their financial records are public documents. Any homeowner has the right to request detailed financial statements, and the HOA legally cannot refuse. But Dorothy revealed something even more interesting. She's done this before. At her previous HOA in Arizona, there were financial irregularities that resulted in her resignation. No charges were filed because they quietly accepted restitution. I was starting to realize I wasn't dealing with just a petty tyrant. I was dealing with a serial HOA fraudster who'd moved to Texas to start fresh. The business sabotage, meanwhile, Barbara's harassment campaign, was escalating. My business insurance company called to inform me they were canceling my policy due to anonymous complaints about unsafe operations and hazardous material storage. Without insurance, I couldn't operate my business. Without my business, I couldn't afford to maintain the ranch. The crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked to check on the horses that evening sounded different somehow, heavier, more ominous. The familiar scent of hay and leather in the barn was now mixed with the bitter taste of financial stress. I could feel the rough wooden rails of the horse stalls under my palms, solid and real, while everything else in my life seemed to be shifting under my feet. But you know what? Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a person is having their back pushed against the wall. It clarifies things. It strips away everything except what really matters. Barbara Whitfield thought she was close to victory. She thought she'd found the perfect pressure point, my livelihood, and that I'd fold like a cheap tent. She was about to learn that there's a difference between a tactical retreat and surrender, and that sometimes the quiet guy in the back of the room is the most dangerous person in the building. Time to stop playing defense and start playing chess. Building the case that weekend, I did what any good engineer does when the scope of a problem becomes clear. I built a spreadsheet. Dorothy had given me enough information to start digging, and what I found would have made a forensic accountant salivate. Using the Freedom of the Information Act, yes, HOAs fall under public records laws, I requested 4 years of financial statements from Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Here's another knowledge nugget for you. Any homeowner can request HOA financial records, and they legally cannot refuse. They might try to stall or charge administrative fees, but public records are public records. What those records revealed was a masterclass in embezzlement. Over 4 years, the HOA had paid $97,000 to 3 companies. BW Enterprises for landscape, consulting, BW Safety Solutions for security services, BW Management Services for administrative consulting. The invoices looked professional. The amount seemed reasonable when spread out over time, and the board had approved every payment, except for one small problem. All 3 companies were registered to the same address, Barbara Whitfield's address. BW stood for Barbara Whitfield. Barbara had created 3 shell companies to systematically bill the HOA for services that either didn't exist or were grossly inflated. The landscape consulting fees were 4 times what the actual landscaper charged. The security services were for a neighborhood that had never had security issues. The administrative consulting was Barbara literally paying herself to do the job she was already elected to do for free. But it got better. I cross-referenced the business registration dates with board meeting minutes and found that Barbara had created each shell company immediately after joining the HOA board. This wasn't opportunistic fraud. This was premeditated. The pattern emerges. I spent Sunday afternoon researching her previous HOA in Arizona. Sure enough, BW Enterprises had operated there too, billing that HOA for similar consulting services until financial irregularities forced Barbara's resignation. No criminal charges were filed because the HOA board quietly accepted restitution to avoid bad publicity. Barbara Whitfield wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a serial HOA fraudster who moved to Texas when Arizona got too hot. Here's the legal reality. Embezzlement over $25,000 is a second-degree felony in Texas, punishable by 2 to 20 years in prison and up to $15,000 in fines. With $97,000 stolen, Barbara was looking at serious time, but the civil exposure was even better. Texas allows triple damages for theft, meaning Barbara could owe the HOA $291,000 plus attorney fees. Add in the harassment lawsuit I was building, and we were talking about enough money to buy her silver Mercedes several times over. I had her, dead to rights. One phone call to the district attorney and Barbara's HOA reign would end in handcuffs. But that felt too easy, too quick. She'd spent months making my life hell, systematically harassing my neighbors and stealing from her community. She deserved a more educational experience. The war council wanted her to dig her hole deeper. I wanted the entire community to see exactly who they'd been trusting with their money in their neighborhood. And most importantly, I wanted to make sure this never happened again. Not here, not anywhere else Barbara might land. So I made a decision that my ex-wife would have called typically stubborn, and my old army buddies would have recognized as tactical patience. Instead of ending this quickly, I was going to let Barbara keep escalating until she hanged herself with her own rope. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer the victim reacting to her attacks. I was the prosecutor building an airtight case. Every move she made from here on out would just add to the evidence pile. Barbara thought she was close to victory, that she'd almost driven the troublesome rancher off his land. She had no idea that her target had just become her biggest threat. Time to assemble my war council. First call went to my army buddy Tom Rodriguez. Not the sergeant, different Rodriguez. Tom had traded his combat engineer uniform for a law degree, and now specialized in civil rights cases in San Antonio. When I laid out the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus," he finally said, "what you're describing isn't just harassment. It's systematic civil rights violations with a clear pattern of discrimination. The fact that she's targeting minorities and veterans elevates this to federal territory." "What are we talking about legally?" "Intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy to violate civil rights, potentially RICO charges if we can prove the financial crimes are part of an ongoing criminal enterprise." Tom's voice got that edge it used to have when he was planning operations. "Plus, she's using her position of authority to harass people based on protected characteristics. That's textbook section 1983 violation. The technical support next. I needed technical support. My nephew Kevin had just finished his computer science degree and was looking for real-world experience. Kid was a wizard with computers and had more patience for documentation than anyone his age should. "Uncle Marcus," he said when I explained the situation, "you need professional-grade evidence collection, not just security cameras. We're talking encrypted backups, social media monitoring, digital forensics. If this goes to court, every piece of evidence needs to be bulletproof." Within a week, Kevin had transformed my property into a surveillance fortress. Hidden cameras with night vision, audio recording, automatic cloud backup, even a system that tracked when Barbara's silver Mercedes passed my driveway. The kid was thorough, the whistleblower, but the most important ally came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Kim called me on a Wednesday evening, voice shaking. "Mr. Thompson, I've been going through more financial records. It's worse than I thought. Much worse." We met again at Murphy's Cafe, but this time Dorothy brought a cardboard box full of documents. I've been secretly copying everything for months. Bank statements, vendor contracts, board resolutions. Barbara has been forging signatures on checks, approving payments without board votes, even transferring money between accounts without authorization. How much are we talking about total? Over 4 years, nearly $190,000. Dorothy's hands were shaking as she poured sugar into her coffee. She's been stealing from us for so long that it's become normal. The other board members just sign whatever she puts in front of them. I realized Dorothy wasn't just an ally, she was a whistleblower, putting herself at considerable risk. Mrs. Kim, what you're doing takes courage, but you need to know that once we pull this trigger, there's no going back. Mr. Thompson, I've been watching her destroy this community for 4 years. She's turned neighbors against each other, driven good people away, and stolen money that was supposed to make our neighborhood better. It has to stop. That's when I knew we had everything we needed. The equipment sabotage. While I was building my case, Barbara was losing her mind. And desperate. People do desperate things. It started on a Monday night. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of metal grinding against metal, a sound that makes every equipment owner's blood run cold. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to my shop, and what I found there made my hands shake with rage. Someone had sabotaged my excavator, sugar in the fuel tank, hydraulic lines cut with a knife, and for good measure they dumped sand into the oil reservoir. $9,500 in repair costs minimum. My business was effectively shut down until I could get everything fixed. But here's the thing about Kevin's surveillance system. It caught everything. Crystal clear footage of a silver Mercedes SUV arriving at 2:34 a.m., Barbara Whitfield stepping out with a toolbox and a bag of sugar, and spending 50 minutes systematically destroying my equipment. The woman was so focused on her sabotage that she never noticed the infrared cameras recording every move. I called Sergeant Martinez first thing in the morning. Sergeant, I need to file a report for destruction of property, and this time I have video evidence. When he saw the footage, his expression went from professional interest to genuine anger. Mr. Thompson, this is a felony. Destruction of property over $3,000 is a state jail felony, and what she did here is closer to aggravated criminal mischief. What does that mean in terms of consequences? 3 years in state jail, $12,000 fine, plus restitution for damages. And now we have her on camera committing a crime. This changes everything. The insurance fraud attempt. But Barbara wasn't done showing her true colors. 3 days later, my insurance agent called with an interesting story. Marcus, I just had the strangest conversation. A woman named Barbara Whitfield contacted our office offering to mediate your dispute if we permanently canceled your coverage. Said she represented the community interest and could make this all go away if we just dropped you as a client. I had to laugh. What did you tell her? I told her that attempting to interfere with someone's insurance coverage is insurance fraud, which is a federal crime. Then I reported the call to our fraud investigation unit. Barbara had just added federal insurance fraud and interference to her growing list of crimes. The woman was like a one-person crime wave. The social media conspiracy. Meanwhile, Kevin was monitoring her social media activity, and what he found was pure gold. Barbara was running a coordination campaign through private Facebook messages, recruiting neighbors to file false complaints, and even offering to pay people's HOA fees if they cooperated with her harassment campaign. Uncle Marcus, look at this, Kevin said, showing me screenshots of her messages. She's literally paying people to lie to city inspectors, and she's documented everything in writing. The messages were like reading the playbook of a conspiracy. If everyone calls code enforcement about the same violation, they'll have to act, she wrote to one neighbor. I'll cover your HOA dues for 8 months if you file a complaint about the noise. But the most damning evidence came from a message to her husband. The insurance thing worked. His business is basically shut down now. A few more pressure points, and he'll have to sell. It was conspiracy in writing with clear intent to cause financial harm. The psychological breakdown. The psychological pressure was getting to Barbara too. Neighbors started reporting erratic behavior, screaming phone calls to city officials, confrontations in the grocery store, and increasingly paranoid posts on social media about outside agitators trying to destroy our community. Dorothy called me with updates from board meetings. She's losing it, Mr. Thompson. Yesterday she accused me of being a spy working for anti-HOA extremists. She's demanding that the board give her emergency powers to deal with what she calls the Marcus Thompson crisis. Emergency powers? She wants authority to place immediate liens on properties, hire private security, and bypass normal board voting procedures. The other members are getting scared of her. That's when I realized Barbara was about to make her biggest mistake yet. In her desperation to maintain control, she was going to overreach so badly that even her rubber stamp board would have to act. The false lien document Dorothy confirmed my suspicions at our next coffee meeting. She's called an emergency board. Meeting for tomorrow night. Topic is addressing immediate security threats to community welfare. She's planning to formalize her harassment campaign as official HOA policy. The beauty of it was that Barbara was about to create an official paper trail of her illegal activities. Instead of just individual harassment, she was going to make it official HOA business, which would implicate the entire board in her conspiracy. Mrs. Kim, are you prepared to record that meeting? She nodded grimly. I've been recording everything since our first conversation. If she's going to destroy this community, at least there'll be evidence of how it happened. Barbara Whitfield was about to cross the line from individual criminal to organizational conspiracy, and she was going to do it in front of witnesses, on the record, with Dorothy documenting every word. Sometimes the best strategy is just giving your enemy enough rope to hang themselves. The emergency meeting, Barbara's emergency board meeting, was everything I hoped it would be, and Dorothy recorded every single word. According to Dorothy's recording, Barbara presented what she called the Thompson Threat Assessment to the board. She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation, I'm not kidding, complete with aerial photos of my property, financial projections of property value decline, and a proposed action plan that would have made a Banana Republic dictator proud. We need immediate authority to place liens on non-compliant properties, Barbara announced to the stunned board. The legal precedent is clear. HOAs have eminent domain powers that supersede individual property rights. That was completely false, by the way. HOAs have no eminent domain powers, and placing liens on properties outside your jurisdiction is theft. But the best part came when board member David Walsh asked a simple question. Barbara, is this property actually within our HOA boundaries? Boundaries are fluid when community welfare is at stake, she replied without missing a beat. Legal technicalities shouldn't prevent us from protecting property values. Dorothy's recording captured the uncomfortable silence that followed. Even Barbara's rubber stamp board wasn't willing to endorse theft and extortion, no matter how she dressed it up. But Barbara wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to find official-looking documents zip-tied to my gate. Notice of immediate lien, Meadowbrook Estates HOA. According to the papers, my property was now subject to a $18,000 lien for accumulated violations and administrative fees. The document was signed by Barbara Whitfield as HOA chairwoman and included a deadline. Payment or property transfer required within 30 days to avoid foreclosure proceedings. I had to hand it to her. The woman had nerve. She just attempted to steal my ranch using fake legal documents. I called Tom immediately. She did what? He asked when I read him the lien notice. Marcus, that's attempted extortion using fraudulent legal documents. In Texas, that's organized criminal activity under the RICO statute. Tom, in plain English, what does that mean? It means she just graduated from local criminal to federal offender. RICO charges carry 25 years in federal prison and complete asset forfeiture. She literally just bet her house on a bluff. The intimidation squad, but Barbara's desperation was reaching truly dangerous levels. That afternoon, my daughter Emma called from college, upset and confused. Dad, someone called my dorm claiming to be from the county sheriff's office. They said you were under investigation for environmental crimes and they needed to verify my contact information for when you're arrested. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. Targeting me was one thing. Involving my kid crossed every line that existed. I called Sergeant Martinez immediately. Someone impersonated a law enforcement officer to harass my daughter at college. I want to file a formal complaint. Mr. Thompson, impersonating a peace officer is a third-degree felony in Texas. If we can prove who made that call, they're looking at serious time. Kevin's tech magic came through again. He traced the call back to Barbara's home phone number. She'd been so rattled that she'd forgotten to use a different phone or block her number. We had her dead to rights on felony impersonation of a peace officer. The vigilante recruitment. The final straw came that weekend. I was having dinner with Michelle Parker, the single mother Barbara had been harassing, and her teenage son David. Michelle had been helping me document the pattern of harassment, and we'd grown close during the investigation. We were sitting on my porch watching the sunset when 4 pickup trucks full of men I didn't recognize pulled up my driveway. They climbed out carrying signs that read, "Respect property values and stop the harassment." The leader, a guy in his 60s wearing a Meadowbrook Estates polo shirt, walked up to my porch. "Mr. Thompson, we're here representing the community. Mrs. Whitfield sent us to discuss your compliance issues." I stood up slowly and Michelle pulled David behind me. "Gentlemen, you're on private property. I'm going to need you to leave. We're not leaving until you agree to stop harassing our HOA chairwoman," he said. And his companions spread out across my yard in what was clearly a practiced intimidation formation. That's when I smiled, because Kevin's cameras were recording everything. And what these gentlemen didn't know was that organized intimidation by multiple people constitutes criminal conspiracy under Texas law. "Michelle, would you mind calling Sergeant Martinez?" I said calmly. "Tell him we have a situation that requires immediate law enforcement response." The sound of gravel crunching under multiple boots, the acrid smell of cigarette smoke and engine exhaust, the feel of my own adrenaline making my hands steady. It all took me back to situations I'd handled in the Army. Except this time I had the law completely on my side. "You know what, fellas," I said, still smiling. "Mrs. Whitfield has made a serious tactical error sending you here, because now she's not just guilty of individual crimes. She's organized a criminal conspiracy." The sirens in the distance were getting louder, and the confident expressions on their faces were starting to waver. Barbara had just upgraded herself from lone criminal to conspiracy ringleader, and she'd done it with witnesses and video evidence. The grand finale, the annual meeting. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and by then, word had gotten out that something big was brewing. The community center was packed with over 250 homeowners, the largest turnout in Meadowbrook history. Dorothy had tipped off the local newspaper, and I'd asked Sergeant Martinez to attend as a community liaison. Barbara arrived in her silver Mercedes, looking like she was heading to a board meeting at Goldman Sachs. Perfect. Hair, designer suit, briefcase full of what I assumed were more fraudulent documents. She had no idea she was walking into her own execution. I sat in the back row with my accordion file of evidence, watching her work the room like the politician she thought she was. "Tonight, we're going to address the security threats that have been plaguing our community," she announced to the crowd. "It's time to take back our neighborhood." The irony was beautiful. Dorothy Kim stood up as secretary to give the financial report, and that's when things got interesting. "Before we discuss new business," Dorothy said, "I think the community deserves transparency about where their money has been going." Barbara tried to shut her down. "Mrs. Kim, we have a set agenda tonight." "The agenda includes the secretary's report," Dorothy replied firmly, "and I have some concerning findings to share." I watched Barbara's face as Dorothy began projecting financial documents onto the screen. 4 years of payments to BW Enterprises, BW Safety Solutions, and BW Management Services, $190,000, in questionable transactions to shell companies registered to Barbara Whitfield's home address. The murmur that went through the crowd was like thunder rolling across the hills. "Our assessment money went to her companies," someone shouted from the middle of the room. "This is character assassination," Barbara screamed, standing up and pointing at Dorothy. "This woman is conspiring with outside agitators to destroy our community." That's when I stood up. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said calmly, "my name is Marcus Thompson. I think we need to talk." The room went dead silent. Everyone had heard about the problem rancher, but most had never seen me in person. "You're not a member of this HOA," Barbara snapped. "You have no right to be here." "You're absolutely right," I said, pulling out my property records. "I'm not a member, never have been, never will be. But you've been harassing me for months, filing false police reports and trying to steal my land with fraudulent liens." I walked to the front of the room and Sergeant Martinez stepped forward to stand beside me. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone The law was literally on my side. For the past 8 months, I continued, Mrs. Whitfield has waged a systematic campaign of harassment against me and other community members. She's filed dozens of false complaints, trespassed on my property, sabotaged my equipment, and even targeted my college-age daughter with threatening phone calls. The crowd was riveted. You could hear a pin drop. But here's what really breaks my heart, I said, looking around the room. She's stolen nearly $200,000 from this community through fake consulting companies. Money that was supposed to improve your neighborhood went into her personal bank account. Barbara was frantically trying to pack up her materials. I don't have to listen to these lies. Ma'am, I said, these aren't lies. Sergeant Martinez, would you like to share what the sheriff's department has discovered? Sergeant Martinez stepped forward with his own folder. Mrs. Whitfield, we have video evidence of you committing felony destruction of property, falsifying police reports, and impersonating a peace officer. We also have evidence of organized criminal activity and conspiracy. The room erupted. Angry. Voices demanding explanations. Board members looking shocked and betrayed, and Barbara standing at the front like a deer in headlights. But I wasn't done. This was my mic drop moment. Mrs. Whitfield, I said, projecting my voice over the crowd. I served 22 years in the Army protecting communities like this one. I never expected the biggest threat to come from someone who was supposed to be serving this community. I turned to address the crowd directly. You trusted her with your money, your neighborhood, your quality of life. She repaid that trust by stealing from you and terrorizing anyone who didn't meet her standards. The newspaper. Reporter was frantically taking notes, and I could see phone cameras recording throughout the room. But here's what I want you to remember, I continued. This community is stronger than one person's greed and prejudice. You have good people here, like Dorothy Kim, who risked everything to expose the truth. You have neighbors who care about each other. Don't let one criminal make you forget that. That's when the most beautiful thing happened. Michelle Parker, the single mother Barbara had been harassing, stood up and started clapping. Then Robert Williams, the Korean War veteran. Then the Rodriguez family. Within seconds, the entire room was giving me a standing ovation, while Barbara Whitfield stood frozen at the front. Sergeant Martinez moved toward her with handcuffs ready. Mrs. Whitfield, you're under arrest for embezzlement, conspiracy, and multiple counts of filing false police reports. As they let her out in handcuffs, she turned and screamed at me. You've destroyed everything. No, ma'am, I replied. I just helped your neighbors see who you really are. The community had seen the truth. Justice was being served, and healing could finally begin. The aftermath. Justice and renewal 8 months later. Barbara Whitfield was sentenced to 6 years in state prison and ordered to pay $570,000 in restitution, triple damages under Texas theft statutes. Her husband filed for divorce and lost his city job. The silver Mercedes was sold at auction to help pay back the community she'd stolen from. But the real victory wasn't putting Barbara behind bars. It was watching Meadowbrook transform into the community it was always meant to be. Dorothy Kim was unanimously elected as the new HOA chairwoman, and her first act was implementing complete financial transparency. Monthly reports are now published online. Every expenditure requires 3 board approvals, and shell company billing is explicitly prohibited in the HOA bylaws. The harassment complaint process I helped them design has become a model for other HOAs across Texas. Any resident can file a formal complaint against board members with mandatory investigation and public hearings. No more secret tribunals or personal vendettas disguised as community standards. Property values actually increased after Barbara's removal. Turns out that stability and trust are worth more than fear and control. Who would have thought? As for the neighbors Barbara had terrorized, they're all thriving now. The Rodriguez family started a landscaping business that now services half the neighborhood. Michelle Parker finished her nursing degree and bought a bigger house 2 streets over. Robert Williams's travel trailer is still in his driveway, and his neighbors now stop by regularly to hear his war stories. The community workshop, the best part of this whole story. I used part of the settlement money to build something that would benefit the entire community. the Meadowbrook Community Workshop. It's a 3,000 square foot building on the back corner of my property, equipped with everything from basic hand tools to welding equipment. Every Saturday morning I teach neighbors how to use the machinery safely. Veterans get priority access, and there's a whole program for teaching kids basic mechanical skills. We've built playground equipment for the elementary school, repaired dozens of neighbors' vehicles, and even constructed a pavilion for the community center. The workshop has become the heart of something Barbara never understood: real community cooperation. The monthly Fix-It clinic draws people from 4 counties over. Elderly residents bring broken appliances, young families learn home repair skills, and teenagers discover that working with their hands is more satisfying than staring at screens. Last month we repaired 63 items that would have otherwise gone to the landfill. Personal victory, on a personal note. Life couldn't be better. Michelle Parker and I got married last fall in a ceremony held right here on the ranch. Her son David calls me the stepdad who fought City Hall and won, and he's become quite the welder himself. My daughter Emma transferred to a Texas university to be closer to our growing family. The ranch is more alive than it's been since my great-grandfather's time. We've got 4 horses, 3 dogs, a barn cat named Sargent after Martinez, and a vegetable garden that feeds half the neighborhood. The broader impact. But here's what I want you to remember from this whole crazy story. Documentation beats confrontation every single time. I could have gone head-to-head with Barbara from day one, but patience and evidence gathering gave me a victory that lasted. When someone tries to bully you, don't get mad, get methodical. Also, know your rights. Property records are public documents. HOA financial statements are public documents. When government officials abuse their authority, there are federal laws designed to stop them. Knowledge is power, and power properly used can protect entire communities. The network grows. The story didn't end with Barbara's conviction. Word spread about our methods, and I started getting calls from property owners across the country facing similar situations. There was a retired teacher in Florida whose HOA was trying to force her to remove her vegetable garden. Using our documentation strategy, she discovered the board was illegally meeting in secret and making decisions without proper votes. The entire board was removed, and her garden became a neighborhood showpiece.